And I'm sure she has many additional important insights about that topic to share with us. Beyond the measurement of inequality, Ingvild also works on other important topics, such as child development and decision-making of households. And of course, all of these topics are closely connected because they ultimately advance our understanding of the conditions under which individuals and societies prosper. Ingvild joined our faculty last year. She came from Stockholm University, where she had been a professor since 2018. Before that, she was working at the Norwegian School of Economics in Bergen, where she also obtained her PhD in 2008. Ingvild works on really important topics that affect us all. She has published extremely well. She presents her work all over the world. She worked as an editor for various journals, and she obtained a large number of grants, including a very prestigious ERC Consolidator grant. Ingvild, we are very happy that you decided to join the University of Zurich. Please welcome Professor Ingvild Almås.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. I'm also very pleased that I came here in June and can interact with all of you. So far, I've already started that, but I'm also looking forward to the years to come. And that made me actually think that I wanted to present quite a broad range of what I've been working on. And I will try to do that, not by speeding up my talking, but I will try to maybe just touch upon some of the topics and talk about several papers, but not give all the details. So let's see how that's going, and then I'm hoping that it will either intrigue you or confuse you or maybe even provoke you to discuss research more with me in the years to come. So I've been working on the measurement of inequality, and I started out wanting to understand how we can measure real income and compare across countries. So once you start crossing national borders, you meet a lot of problems, and it was already mentioned by Nick that one of the issues is that we need to adjust for price level differences. I've also worked on how income is distributed, or resources more broadly are distributed. And of course, there we're interested in causes, but also consequences, and how policy works. Then, last thing I will talk about today is how do people think we should distribute income? So that's a very positive question. It's not the normative question. It's not how we think or how scientists should think that it should be distributed, but it's how populations, general populations, would believe it should be distributed. So then, when we look at the standard approach to the measurement of inequality, we typically select a measure of real income. We represent the distribution using a Lorenz curve or a scalar index such as the Gini. Real income would typically be constructed by adjusting nominal income for purchasing power. But there are three limitations that I will talk through and use my papers to illustrate some of these issues. So first limitation is that we need to find these deflators, and it's difficult. And it's difficult both because we don't know theoretically what the right way to do that is, but also there are a lot of empirical challenges. We will also talk about within household inequality and how that comes into play. So typically when we get data, we would either get individual level data or household level data. But then if you look at inequality, we know that individual level data may exaggerate existing inequalities because there is sharing going on within households. But if you look at household level information and just use per capita within the household as a measure of resources, you may underestimate the level of inequality because there may not be equal sharing within the households. And then I will talk about the fact that when we use the standard approach, we would implicitly use a norm which is consistent with an egalitarian norm in the sense that we compare the actual distribution to an equal distribution. That may not be what people find to be fair. So we will talk about how we can generalize the standard approach to try to measure something that people perceive as unfair in the society. So then I'll start out with my childhood project in academia. So this was my very first paper. I wanted to try to look at how we can cross borders and compare incomes across borders and adjust for price level differences. And I've been in a group that discuss how to do this now for several years. And one thing that is clear is that people have different views on whether we should take a statistical approach to this problem or whether we should take an economic approach to this problem. The statistical approach would be to find an index to aggregate prices. Well-known such statistical indices would be the Laspeyres and Page indices. As you may know, the Laspeyres is typically used for the consumer price index, whereas the economic approach would be to find the cost of living, taking into account consumer behavior. So what that would mean, for example, is that if you have relative price level differences across countries, as an example, the Laspeyres would find one reference level of prices, so one reference price vector, and then it would compare the consumption in two countries using that reference vector. Of course, we know that if consumers actually face that reference price vector instead of their own prices, they would choose differently. So they would substitute towards goods that are less expensive and away from goods that are more expensive at these reference prices. Okay, so then what I realized when I was doing development studies as an undergraduate was that different methods would give different results. So if you use the exchange rate-based method to study global inequality, first of all, you would find higher inequality than if you use the PPP-adjusted incomes, which is natural because we think that price levels are lower in poorer areas, typically. However, we also learned, and I understood, that we had some challenges with this existing PPP adjustments. So when I was wondering whether I wanted to do a PhD in economics, I figured I really want to do it, and I want to try to understand these measurement differences. And the reason was that not only did the exchange rate-based method show larger inequalities, but also the trends were different. So what we saw was that different policymakers or different institutions would choose different ways of measuring things that would typically fit better with kind of the message they had to the world, right? So there was this frustration in me saying, okay, we really need to figure out about measurement because otherwise it's up to stakeholders to choose whatever suits their purpose. So this is my first project as economist. So I had this idea going into the PhD program that we could use angle curves for food. There is this economic regularity that says that the richer you are, the lower the budget share spent on food is. And you can look at many data sets around the world, and typically you find a log linear relationship. So this seems to be very stable. For the very poorest, in the poorest countries, there may be a little bit of a hump shape, but even in the very poorest country, it seems to be log linear for most part of the population. The idea was simply to use that to estimate such a curve, and then you don't need to go through price deflators, because you can essentially use the budget share and find the real income. So that was a simple idea, but I did go through with it, and this is the world angle curve for food that was estimated in that paper. And what I did was to estimate the full demand system. So it was not only this angle curve, so I adjusted for relative price level differences and also demographics, etc. But what we saw was that typically the poor countries' angle curves would be sort of shifted out, and the rich countries' angle curves would be shifted not as much as here, but a little bit to the left. Which means that income is overestimated the poorer you are. And I found this very systematically using this method, showing that the poorer you are, the more your income is overestimated, meaning that the more the price levels are underestimated. Was this big or small? It was big, it turned out, at least if you believe in this structural way of estimating the prices, right? So if you believe in this identification, it turned out that for OECD countries, the Penwell table would show very accurate measures of real income. Whereas for the poorer countries and the middle-income countries, the exchange rate-based method would actually be better. Even though theoretically we know we should adjust for price level differences, but according to my method, we did so poorly at the time and in a systematic way, so actually if you wanted to look at global inequality for the world, right, including non-OECD countries, we would actually come much closer with this angle curve-based method than the Penwell table method. Now, big things happened in the World Bank, who produced these international comparison data just after this paper was out, and lots have happened since then, right? So I'm not claiming that these biases are there necessarily, and the adjustments were exactly like this. They were adjusted so that poorer countries looked poorer in the new updated versions. And one main thing that happened was that we actually had data for many poor countries. Before we had sort of just simulated data for many countries. Okay, so just to summarize this part of the talk, I kind of want to vote for the economic approach, although it's challenging. So we want to try to take into account consumer behavior and get to a cost of living adjustment and not only aggregate prices. We need to think about non-homotheticity, and there are other papers I just wanted to mention. Timo's paper also here because it's, many of you will know it. But we need to take account also of non-homotheticity, which is typically not done in the Penwell table, right? So if it is true that poor people spend more on food than rich people, we actually need to weight food prices more for the poor than for the rich. And it was already mentioned, the paper in China, which is exactly what we do there in the paper in India, where we actually have income-specific price adjustments. Of course, it gets even harder if you allow people to have different preferences. So how can we even think about people being different, choosing differently, wanted to choose differently? And we have a paper where we have sort of an approach, we discuss that, but it's not solved in this work. Even harder maybe today, when we have many goods we consume or services we consume, that wouldn't even have a price, and that is really hard to put sort of a welfare number on. So now I was newly appointed as an advisor for the World Bank for this international comparison program that I kind of started out almost criticizing in my first work, so I'm very happy about that. So now I can try to contribute and also learn more and get updates for the work that has happened since that time. Okay, so then I will go on to the next topic, which is within household inequality. And as I said, data on income and consumption would typically either be measured at the individual level or at the household level. And individual level may then exaggerate inequalities because there is sharing going on within the household, whereas household level data may mask inequalities because there is not necessarily equal sharing within households. So who gets what? We don't know. We know some things about this around the world. We don't know a whole lot, I would claim. So we had we wrote a handbook chapter on this, and where we tried to just summarize the literature or the evidence we have, which would use direct elicitation methods, which simply tries to ask, how do you consume within the house, or how are you sharing resources within the household directly? We also looked at the structural collective model approach, so there are quite a few estimations from different countries trying to estimate this using structural models. And then there are also structural models that include leisure. So it's not only talking about consumption shares within the household, but also resource shares, including leisure. Okay, so just very briefly, sort of the summary of what we saw there. 5 studies using this direct elicitation across the world. And you see that in Denmark, actually, they suggest that it's equal sharing or more for the women than for the men. And it says method 1 and 2 here. It's simply that you could use public goods in 2 different ways. So you elicit then private goods, which are quite easy to find their shares. For public goods, it's much harder. You could think that everyone would have access to it in the household, so you should just split equally, which is what is done in this method 2. This method 1 suggests that, okay, there may be some power that you measure from this private sharing, so you actually just share the public good as you do with the private shares. But you see that for particularly Bangladesh and Japan, it's more to the men. For Denmark, it's more to the women, but for the Netherlands, it suggests that it's actually quite equal within the households. And this is average, of course. You can find household-specific values for this. For the structural models, you see quite a few countries, again, Bulgaria, France, Mexico, UK, where you find larger shares for women, and then you find Bangladesh, Spain, Mexico, Malawi, where you find larger shares for men, on average again. Very last approach, where you include leisure. Again, you see Japan, UK, and the US are sort of having smaller share for women, Denmark and Netherlands more. Of course, even more interesting, which we also do in my view at least, what we do in the handbook is also to look at poverty and specific household level. This is just aggregated at country level, right? But you can look at specific households and sharing within and look at how that changes poverty estimates. So in some of these countries, you see that poverty is actually larger if you take account of within household inequality, because there are many women in Bangladesh, for example, that would not necessarily reach, sort of get above the poverty line if you use the shares within household and not only the average household resources or income. Okay, so then going from that sharing within household among adults, and in all this we sort of assume there are two adults. Of course, there may be different household compositions around the world, but they typically focus on two decision makers, two adults. Now let's think about how this would influence children. So there is sort of something we taught, even in PhD classes in economics, was that you should target women because it's good for children. Now, I think we start to realize that that's not always true. So empirically, the backing for this claim is not very strong. You find it in some studies. There was an early study in the UK where they found that there was a reform where mothers would get more bargaining power or more empowerment, and you saw that the household would spend more on children's clothing. This is a famous study and often referred to. But then when we try to test it experimentally in many settings around the world, it doesn't really come through. So it depends on what kind of context you're in, what kind of goods you study, etc. So we discussed this and other things in this presidential address by Orazio Attanasio, where we show that on a small sample, 450 couples in Tanzania, so this was a pilot study for a bigger study that I will talk about in a minute, where we study household decision-making and shares. We had a dictator game-like situation where we said either to the mother or to the father, so we randomized who would be able to choose. They could distribute for themselves, for their spouse, and for the child. And then we look at whether mothers or fathers give more to the children, and we also measure power in household decision-making. That's very difficult to measure. So I won't go into details about that, but some of my research actually did try to suggest new methods to measure this bargaining power between men and women in the household. So what we found was that women gave more to the child than men, but the effects were quite small, the differences were quite small. We also found that the power in household decision-making was much lower for women than men in Tanzania, which kind of suggests that even if there is this preference difference, maybe it doesn't matter so much in the end, because in the household setting, women may not have the power to sort of act on their preferences. And then on top of that, of course, non-homothericity may mean that in the household setting, not in the lab setting that we had, but in the household setting, maybe that women have less for themselves to begin with, so they prioritize more for themselves than children, even if the preferences are such that they would, with equal income or equal resources, devote more to children. Okay, so then just briefly about my ERC project. So we're really trying to get at these shares, both by direct elicitation, but also through experimental work, both lab work and RCTs. So one thing we want to study is elicit these shares directly. We build on a study in Japan. We validate the measure that we can use globally, and we use it in a global study. Then we also look at what can be referred to as the maternal argument. So is it true that if you give to women, they will spend more on children, or the household will spend more on children? We have this dictator-like situation again. We have validated it in Tanzania, in India, and we are going to do it in Norway, hopefully. It will validate there too, where we compare an incentivized version of the dictator game to a hypothetical version. Because in the global study, we need to run a hypothetical version to reach all the countries and the representative samples. Then the third thing we do in the ERC project is to elicit the effect of targeted transfers and other policies to study equality within the household, but also the parental decision-making and child development. So just very briefly on that. We have an RCT, and this is joint work with Esther, my friend who is here from Tanzania, and others. So we have a parenting program, an app, and we have an unconditional cash transfer scheme, and we have a combined treatment, and we have a control group. And part of what we want to look at here, and I can't talk about this, obviously, everything here, but I'm super happy to just mention it so that we can discuss it maybe more as we evolve, as this project evolves. But one thing, of course, we wanted is to have the unconditional cash transfer randomly targeted to men or women in the household. So we can actually follow what happens when you actually transfer to men and women. So that's what I wanted to mention here in this talk. We have a lab in the field experiment where we have a dictator-like situation where they allocate. And then we have a nationally representative data collection that now I'm so happy that Devin and I can work on to elaborate on this. And actually we will add an intervention on infant nutrition and focus on breastfeeding to this at the center that I'm chairing here and work with Devin on that. So this is work in progress. We have, just for the lab experiment, these are the regions for this is the region Dodoma, that's the capital region. These are the villages where we have the RCT, that's also where we have the lab experiment. We ask the couples to come to the lab together, and only if they come together, they will be allowed in. But we randomize whether the mother participates, the father participates, or the couple participates together. And then we have an allocation game where they get an endowment, and then they can allocate in a first phase resources to themselves, their spouse, and the target child, which is, I didn't talk about it, but in this RCT, they are recruited when they're pregnant, so there is a target child that is born at this point. And a little bit more than 1 year old. And then there is a second phase where they can use the allocation to purchase goods from a pop-up store. This is only the incentivized part. As I said, we validate the hypothetical version, so we look at whether it matters that they actually get goods and services from this. Oh, sorry, not services here in this case, just goods, yeah. So what do we see? We do see that mothers, on average, in the control group, would devote more to children. But it's not huge here either. It's like 3.6 percentage points, but it's significant, and it's there. But what we find very interesting, and what we will study more, is that with our treatment, this actually disappears. So mothers do not give anything more to the children, whether they're in the control group or treatment groups. Whereas for fathers, it's different. So for fathers, they get this unconditional cash transfer scheme, and then for those who get it, they will know that they get it because they have a child in this age range. So it's kind of a child allowance. And we see that if they're in the parenting intervention that I unfortunately don't have time to discuss, but it's sort of following up from a health worker with an app. Even the fathers who also participate, if they can, they do prioritize children more than in the control group after this. Even more so if they were targeted with the UCT, and even more so if they had the combined treatment with the parenting, so they learn about the child and the child's needs, and they get cash. So it may be both, for fathers, a financial constraint and an information constraint to begin with. So actually what we do here, and we show, is that it is a gap there, it's not huge, so that's up to you to sort of think about whether you think the maternal argument is very important here or not, but what we show, it's there, but we close it by this intervention. Okay, so then we have a situation here where mothers in status quo give more to children. They prioritize children more. So in that sense, it's correct what we thought in PhD courses in development economics before. But it's not true in all contexts. And we show that even with this treatment that we have, the control trial that we have ongoing for 15 months, the fathers choose differently after that. So it may not be gender per se, it may be the roles and both the information we have and the roles we are put in. So, and moreover, what I find more important is that this suggests, and other papers suggest now, that actually the margin may be even more important with fathers, because it's actually, it may be that even if we target mothers, if we focus on mothers, they may not move so much. Maybe they prioritize children already. But maybe if fathers have more information and they are the main decision makers in the household, then that may actually matter more. So I think it is a mistake of us to say that because in status quo mothers prioritize children, it may not be where you should put sort of the policy and try to make changes. Okay. So then, the very last part. So how can we get the norm right? So remember when I said that in the standard approach, we take the actual distribution in the society and we compare it to an equal distribution. This may not represent what people worry most about. So people may worry about some inequalities, but not other inequalities. So implicitly, if you only focus on income inequality and you say this is kind of tells something about the justice in the society or the fairness in the society, if you use inequality measures like that, you implicitly say that the egalitarian distribution is the fair distribution. And this may not be what people find to be fair. So there may be fair inequalities, and there may be unfair inequalities. And in economics, we have been very much focusing on this equality-efficiency trade-off. So we may want equality, but it comes at the cost of less efficiency in the society. Now, it may be a different story as well, is that it's not inequality per se we should worry about. It is whether people perceive it as fair or unfair. So then I wanted to just briefly mention a study between Norway and the US, where we compare representative samples in the two countries. We do ask them whether fairness is important for how you vote in federal elections. And this is just showing that both in the US and in Norway, it's either very important or moderately important for the majority of the people. In this paper, we also elicit fairness preferences for people. And I won't talk about that, but I will talk about a study, a global study, where US and Norway is also included, but many other countries, where we also elicit fairness preferences. So what do people find fair when it comes to income distribution? And we measure beliefs about what's actually happening. Because what could also happen is that you perceive an inequality as fair or unfair because you have biased beliefs. So it may not even be correct what you think exists in the society. So both preferences and beliefs may matter, and we elicit both. So, on the preference side, people differ in inequality acceptance because they differ in both the trade-off between equality and efficiency, potentially, but also what they consider to be fair inequalities. On the belief side, people differ because they differ in beliefs about how equality affects efficiency, but also in what they believe to be the causes of inequality. So is it really that those who are poor are lazy, or is it that they are born into worse circumstances than the rich? So in this global study, we elicit preferences. So we study real distributive behavior in representative populations in 60 countries. We put them in identical environments, so the decision makers, they see identical environments. And we randomly vary the source of inequality and the cost of redistribution. So we want to get at both the efficiency argument and what they find to be fair, these representative populations. On the belief side, we measure beliefs about the equality-efficiency trade-off. but also the sources of inequality. And then we measure policy attitudes. So this is not done in an experimental way. So this relates preferences and beliefs to general policy attitudes. Just if you want, it's kind of our external validity test. I mean, you may buy it or not, but that's what we have. Okay. So to the study design, we have the pink here are those we have in our study, the blue one we don't have. But you see that we cover many of the populous countries in the world. We cover, here's a list of countries, Switzerland is there, many other countries as well, and we have representative samples for 80% of the world population. We have spectators, so we have representative samples deciding on actual workers' distribution. So it's incentivized, but on the fairness margin. So it's not, these decision makers are not themselves stakeholders in the situation. But they do know that there are real workers, they worked, and you, now the spectator, would decide the actual distribution. We had 3 treatments for the fairness part or the preference part of this experiment. It's the luck. There are always 2 workers. The spectators would decide the distribution between these 2 workers. And in the luck treatment, they know it's random who gets more. In the merit treatment, they know it's the most productive worker gets more. And in the efficiency treatment, it's again a random process, but it's costly to send money from one worker to another. There's an iceberg cost, so if you send $2, only 1 will arrive at the other person. So in all these treatments, there are $6 given to one worker and 0 to the other. And then we ask, how would you like to distribute or redistribute? First, we ask, would you like to redistribute? And then we say, if they say yes, we say how much. And then in the first, the luck and the merit treatments, it's not costly. So they can send $3 and it will arrive, and then they get to an equal distribution here. In the efficiency treatment, if they send $2, it's only 1 that arrives. So if they want equality, it's 2-2 in the efficiency. So we try to sort of mimic a deadweight loss situation. So just very briefly, the theoretical framework. So you can think about a social preference model where you have a loss. So the spectator is not him or herself part of the distributional situation, right? So there's no income for yourself in this utility function. So the only thing that is there is a potential loss if you deviate from what you found to be fair. So this is what you give now to the worker who got 0. And this is what you find to be fair to give to that worker. If you deviate from that, you get the loss, which we here model as a quadratic loss. And then if there is an efficiency cost, this part kicks in, that if you lose money for the workers, that's also not good. So what you see here, and I will not show any structural estimates of this. So we have papers where we estimate structurally these kinds of utility functions. Here, the experimental randomization is actually sufficient, I would claim, to actually get at what we want. So we don't need to estimate this structurally, so it's here to fix ideas about how we think about it. Now, of course, if you care a lot about fairness relative to efficiency, this beta is very high. Okay. Luck treatment. So if it's purely a random process that leads one worker to earn $6 and the other worker to earn $0, not all spectators in the world would equalize. So actually, the average Gini index, for these all the pairs we see around the globe, is around 0.45. So at least to me, when I started working on this, I found this a bit high when it's really just a random process that people don't, it's not costly to redistribute, but they still implement quite a lot of inequality. Now, what we see, and what we also saw in the Norway-US study, and now it's the whole world population, is that if you introduce productivity as a difference, or production as a difference, you see that all these spectators, not all of them, but in general, spectators accept much more inequality. So there's a treatment effect going from this random process to a process where it's actually productivity difference that matters. So this is just saying the source of inequality matters for what you find fair. They are free to do whatever, so this we think is a revealed preference approach, and we elicit preferences here. So people prefer to accept more inequalities if inequalities are due to differences in productivity than if it's due to a random process. So what do you think about efficiency? So it's a cost, which I thought was quite large. So it's like 50% disappears if you send. It's much lower. So people worry much less about efficiency, at least if you use our elicitation method, then people care about fairness. So maybe we've been wrong in economics, focusing so much on this equality-efficiency trade-off, if we really want to please the general populations, that is. Maybe we know better, so maybe we should still do it. But if we want to think about what the general populations are thinking about, the fairness arguments are much stronger. Although, you see, the efficiency argument is also there. They implement significantly larger inequalities. Okay, so this is just a regression. It's just a treatment dummy, so it's not very advanced. But what I wanted to illustrate here is that what we could do, which very few studies would do, is to look at the non-word samples. So this is sort of the non-Western, non-educated, not industrialized, rural, rural and not democratic societies, or people. So you see it doesn't really add up. So these are the word people. So some of you know this very well, I know, but we have a lot of studies around the Boston area, right? So we know a lot about the Western, rich, educated, industrialized people. We know much less about these word people. And Piketty writes about it, many people write about it, that is really the meritocratic argument that would justify inequalities in most societies. Now, if you look at this, it's actually not so clear. I mean, it's still there for the non-word sample, but it's much, much smaller. So it may be that in the non-word populations that we have studied much less, this meritocratic argument is not as strong as it is for the word populations. Okay, so this is the implemented inequality in the luck, and the reason why I wanted to show this map is that you see a lot of inequalities across countries in the luck. You see less inequalities across countries in the merit treatment. So it seems that people agree more around the globe across countries when it comes to how to distribute, when it's productivity that would be the source of inequality. So then let's think about people. So there may be within countries as well differences across people. And I said that this standard approach to inequality, if you really use that as a fairness measure, it's consistent with those who find the egalitarian norm to be the just norm or the fair norm. We can find the egalitarian people by looking at those who find inequalities due to luck and performance unfair. So they will always equalize. The meritocratic people would be those that say that inequality due to luck would be unfair, but not due to productivity, or at least they would accept more inequality. Maybe not perfect inequality, but they would accept more inequality if it's due to productivity. Then you have the libertarians who would say inequality is due to luck and performance are fair, so I don't want to intervene at all. So then this is the wild distribution of these types. So, and it's sorted by the share of meritocratic people in a country. And what was really striking, to us at least, is that India and China would have very few meritocratic people. They would have a lot of libertarian people. You see the share of egalitarian is also quite small in all countries. So if you look here, it's really more of a Western phenomenon, if you want, the meritocratic position being the largest one. We also elicited beliefs. I don't have time to talk much about it, but one thing that stands out is that luck is seen or believed to be a more important source of inequality than hard work and ability. So these are kind of the meritocratic factors, if you like. So you can be more productive because you work hard or because you have better abilities. Okay, so summary, the fairness story appears to be more important than the efficiency story for the inequality acceptance. Merit considerations are important in almost all countries, but there are important variations in this. People tend to believe luck is more important than merit, which means that existing inequalities are seen as unfair. And richer countries are more meritocratic, but not more efficiency-seeking. So then to the very last study that I wanted to rush through is a study that we call the selfish rich hypothesis study. So this is also eliciting beliefs about why some people are rich and why some people are poor. And we study it in the same 60 countries, and we provide this claim to these spectators or these general populations, and we say, the rich are richer than the poor because they have been more selfish in their life than the poor. And then we look at how many agrees. And this was kind of striking to us that a lot of people agree completely with this claim. This is the global data now. There is variation across countries, and you see it on the map too, quite large differences across countries, and that may just reflect that it matters. Selfishness may also matter more in some countries than other countries, right? But it is quite striking that it is an important position in all countries around the world, and the most important belief in the global context. So we can relate this to crime and also mobility. So we also ask in Afghanistan, if you're in Afghanistan, one of the main reasons for the rich being richer than the poor is that the rich have been more involved in illegal activities than the poor. There is a strong and significant positive correlation between crime level or beliefs in crime and belief in the rich, selfish rich hypothesis, which is maybe not so surprising. Mobility is the other way around. So if you ask, can people in this country get ahead by working hard or not? There is a significant negative correlation between the response to that question and the belief in the selfish rich hypothesis. Now, the very last thing is that it seems to be self-serving biases in these beliefs. So it may be, we see that when we ask the educated and high-income people this question, they tend to believe less in this hypothesis than when we ask the non-educated and poorer part of the population. Okay, so what have we seen so far? Inequality or fairness, should we use a different norm than the egalitarian? We see that few people are egalitarian, so it speaks to that, at least if we want to use inequality measures as sort of saying this is what people find fair or it's problematic with these inequalities. Most people are sensitive to the source of inequality, and we can generalize the Lorentz curve and also the Gini index to take account of a different norm than this egalitarian norm. I work on a global study with Paul Huffe in Bristol and also Daniel Weischer, who is in Cologne, where we want to measure both preferences and beliefs that we can on factors that we can relate to observational data. So now we want to try to actually measure the perceived unfairness in many countries, but we also want to compare it to actual unfairness in the labor market using observational data on labor market outcomes. Okay. So that was a marathon of papers and studies. So I gave some examples of my work on income inequality, and the focus going forward will be on all of them. But as you may know, I will focus more on household decision-making in child and adolescent development than I have done before. So I'm looking forward to interacting with all of you in the future, and I'm so happy to be here. So thank you so much for coming.